Thanks so much, Jackson. And hi to all of you. Thanks you so much for being here. I'm curious if folks want to just toss in the chat or come off of mute for a second, if there's anything in particular you're excited about learning this evening. Josh and I will be covering, everything from the different branches of the Maine government to effective ways to advocate for things at the state in the state government, and how to write your own legislation. So curious if anyone has anything that you're particularly interested in, please feel free to put it in the chat or raise your hand. And also throughout the presentation, please feel free to throw questions in the chat or raise your hand, and happy to make this as interactive as folks would like it to be. Okay. All right. No one has any immediate questions or okay. Oh, okay, Allison, awesome. Comprehension and understanding of legislative documents. Cool. Okay, we'll make sure to touch on that. Definitely a complicated part of this aspect of work is just understanding how to read legal documents. Cool. All right. Well, yeah, as I just said, anything as things come up, please feel free to pop them in the chat or raise your hand. So here are a couple of the top takeaways for today that we have for you. First and foremost, we hope that you'll get from this presentation the recognition that the Maine legislature is really accessible. Legislative advocacy is not the only way to advance goals and priorities and our work, but it is a tool in our toolbox. And in Maine, we're lucky to have a legislature that is made up of essentially volunteers, folks who are not paid a ton for their work in the Maine legislature, and who represent relatively small portions of the population in comparison to other states or to our federal delegation. So like your state representative, for example, represents about 10,000, 11,000 people. I can't remember the exact number off the top of my head. But really, they want to hear from you, their constituents. And that's a lot different from, say, I have a friend who lives in New York, and she has to like make appointments with legislators in advance, like weeks or months in advance. Whereas I can text my state rep, hey, do you want to grab coffee? And she'll be like, yeah, that sounds great. So yeah, top takeaway is the Maine legislature is accessible, and anyone can participate in making laws, and there are many ways to participate, and we'll get into that as we go. Another piece is that coalition building is really critical, and building intersectional coalitions to build power for achieving our goals. And then also that adult allies are a resource, but not an end-all be-all. There are a lot of really great adult ally organizations in the climate and climate justice space in Maine and beyond, who are here as resources to you all as youth. But really, we as young people are the future of the state, and we should be leading and relying on adult allies as a resource, but as it says, not an end-all be-all. If you wouldn't mind going to the next slide. Thanks, Jackson. So, all right, a little civics 101. There are 3 branches in Maine's government, just like our federal government, and they're in equal rank to each other. And so each branch has its own duties and responsibilities, and I'll get into each of these in the next couple slides. Next slide, please, Jackson. All right, so the executive branch is headed by the governor, which is currently Governor Janet Mills, who's a Democrat. She has the duties of approving or vetoing laws that have been passed by the legislature. She's also responsible for executing laws passed by the legislature. She calls the Senate and House to session, meaning that she has the ability to call all the state representatives and senators from across the state to the State House to conduct their work. They cannot serve more than 2 consecutive terms. So Janet Mills is currently on her 2nd term, which ends coming up in 2026. And then also, the executive branch can introduce legislation at any time. So we'll get into that a little bit as we get into how to create a law. But unlike state representatives and state senators, the governor can introduce legislation at any time. All right, then we have the judicial branch, which is tasked with interpreting the laws that are passed by the state legislature and executive branch. It's headed by the Maine Supreme Court, and answers requests by the governor and legislature to issue opinions on current or proposed bills. And then it also includes lower courts like district and superior courts. And then the legislative branch is what we'll talk most about today, is tasked with writing and developing and amending laws. In Maine, it's composed of 35 senators and 151 representatives, and they are all reelected every 2 years. So unlike the federal government, where it's staggered, and not every single person is up for reelection, every 4 or 6 years, or 2 or 6 years, all of the senators and representatives in Maine are reelected every 2 years. And then the leadership of the legislature is elected by legislators, and includes 10 legislators on what's called the Legislative Council. And then there's also a Speaker of the House and a Senate President. Next slide, please. So this is a bit about kind of what that means right now in Maine. So in the Senate right now, there's a majority Democratic majority, sorry. So we have 20 Democrats, 15 Republicans. In the House, there's the same majority, but it's a little tighter. So there's 75 Dems, 73 Republicans, and then 1 independent and 1 unenrolled, meaning that they're not enrolled in either party. The Senate president is Matty Daughtry, and House Speaker is Ryan Fecteau, and those are both Democrats. And then we also have a Democratic Attorney General, Aaron Frey, and Secretary of State, who's Joseph Perry. And this is just an interesting graphic that looks at where how this makeup looks on a map. And I think it's just a fascinating graphic. So you can see that though there are Democratic majorities, both in the House and the Senate, when you look at this whole state of Maine on a geographic level, it's very, very concentrated along the coast and in southern Maine, where the Democratic majorities are. And I think I'll leave it this one's mine too. How to find your legislators. We'll throw these links in the chat as well. But our first step to action is really knowing who you're working with. So these are a couple links to find your state legislators, and then also all the other elected officials that represent you. And with that, I will pass it over to Josh.
Thanks, Sonia. And it is good to know who represents you. Legislators will listen to you if you have a good idea and you want to talk to them about how you feel, but they will listen to you much more so if you plan to vote for them, or if you are going to vote for them in the future, or if you're a current constituent of theirs who benefits from their policy making. So make sure you do know who your state senator and state representative are. I'm going to hang out on this slide for a little bit because I think it's a really important one and a slightly complex one. And this is not necessarily the way that a bill moves every single time. I find myself learning something new every single time I go over to the State House, even though I've been around the block a few times here. It feels like, there are a lot of new rules that get thrown at you in the State House, but there's a general process by which a bill can become law. And I don't have a song for it, I'm sorry, but I do have a timeline. So initially, if you have a good idea, and I say you because it can be any person that has a good idea, you can approach a legislator and say, I have this really good idea, and I hope that you champion it. The legislator then can champion it, or they can bring forward ideas on their own, and basically write down the idea and then send it along to the revisor's office. I do want to note here too, this is a bit of a process point. Legislators get elected in early November, and they're elected for a 2-year term. They're expected to get all of their legislative ideas into the revisor's office by December 15th, which is a very narrow window. It's about a month and a half. And so the intention here is to make sure that people are coming into office with certain intentions and that they can't just introduce legislation at any point during their 2 years within the legislature, because that would make for a pretty hectic time. We still get over 2,000 bills every single legislative session that have to be processed. So it's a condensed time period in which to submit bills. And it's a critical period in which we as advocates are working with legislators to try to socialize the ideas that we want to see move forward. Anyway, that's a bit of a tangent, but you then send this idea to the revisor's office, and the revisor's office is basically a bunch of lawyers, and they turn it into legal language that aligns with Maine code so that if it gets passed, it'll insert right into Maine's laws and statutes. The revisor's office then takes a look at the bill and tries to associate what the content might be with the right committee. So Maine has like 20 to 22 legislative committees, ranging from the Environment and Natural Resources Committee to the Energy, Utilities and Technologies Committee to Judiciary, Government Oversight, Veterans Affairs, right? So the revisors are trying to figure out what topic does this bill pertain to and which committee would it be best situated to. So let's say it's on transportation, they send it to the Transportation Committee. The committee then has the opportunity to review the bill, and this is really where you as a citizen might have the best opportunity to come and make your voice heard directly to that committee. So the committee has to have a hearing on every bill that it receives. So when that hearing happens, you're able to go up to the State House and give your 3 minutes about why it is that you feel this idea should move forward. We'll talk a little bit more about testimony, but this is really one of the most direct ways to make your voice heard at the legislature is providing testimony to the 13 legislators on a given committee. The legislators then take a look at this bill and they bring it back for what's called a work session, if any changes have to be made, any amendments, and then they collectively vote on it. And they vote either ought to pass or ought not to pass. And then it moves on with that recommendation to the full House and the full Senate. It'll move to whichever chamber the sponsor is a part of. So if the sponsor is a senator, it'll go to the Senate first. If the sponsor is a representative, it'll go to the House first. But it has to go to both chambers twice, which is bureaucratic, but important for democracy. And then basically, after it is presumably passed in the House and the Senate by majority votes, it goes on to the governor. The governor can then sign it right away and say, yes, this passes, carry on, veto it, in which case it's dead unless it can go back to the House and Senate and get a 2/3 vote to push past a governor's veto, to override the veto is what it's called. Or the governor cannot touch it whatsoever and say, I don't want my name on this. But if she doesn't touch it and then 10 days pass and the legislature is still in session, it becomes law anyway. So it can basically be passed without an explicit governor's signature. A weird thing happened at the end of last year where there were like 23 bills still on the governor's desk when the legislative session adjourned, and she didn't sign them. And so they all basically died because the legislative session was not continuing. And that was a bummer. And we can get into that a little bit as well, because sometimes bills you think have made it to the finish line and don't quite get over that finish line. So anyway, sorry to stay on one slide for a long time, but that's the process. There are a lot of ways to make your voice heard throughout the process. I noted a couple of them previously, but of course, first and foremost, electing legislators, right? You can vote for the legislator that you believe best carries your values, or you can volunteer for campaigns to try to elect legislators and organizing in your community, talking to folks about who you think should lead your given community. Voicing your opinion generally is also phenomenal. We are big fans of op-eds and letters to the editor. Representatives are often reading their local papers to understand where public sentiment is. So it's really important that you get your voice out there. And organizations like ours, Maine Audubon or Natural Resources Council of Maine, can help to facilitate that process for you if you're interested in writing a letter to the editor. contacting your legislator is really the bread and butter of legislative advocacy. As Anya said, I mean, they're very accessible. All of these folks have their cell numbers and their emails listed on their legislative profile. You can just reach out to them. And I think you'd be surprised actually how few people choose to do this. You know, I've heard often that if a legislator hears from 2 to 3 constituents, then that issue's on their radar. If they hear from over 5 constituents, it's becoming a priority issue. And if they hear from 10 or more, it's definitely something they're paying attention to, right? So it doesn't take that many voices to elevate something to a given legislator. And again, you can call them, you can email them. One thing that we really like to do is hold meetings with legislators. So we'll go and find a place in their district that is a convenient place to meet and greet, and then you can recruit your friends to sit down and actually have a conversation with legislators. Again, these people are just, they're people, you know, they're paid very little. They're mostly doing this for service to their community. And you know, I'm sure that if you look up your legislator right now, you'll know someone who knows them, right? Testimony, I won't spend too much longer on that, but basically great opportunity to make your voice heard. This is something especially we can help you with. We do this all the time, you know, providing testimony to legislators, but anyone can do this. Go up and give their 3 minutes. Organizing is so critical. You know, mobilizing, telling your community about bills and how you're supporting them, providing opportunities for your community to support an issue that you believe in. And then staying informed. Don't bear the burden of responsibility on your shoulders alone, but it is a good idea to make sure that you know about the issue that you want to speak to a legislator about. I will say though, you're an expert on your own experience, right? So what legislators want to hear is why something matters to you, to the person that's living in their district, and that's what's most important that you bring to the State House. So we can jump to the next slide here. Appropriations in the state budget, I anticipate getting a couple questions about this. We're not going to be able to get into the full details of how this works, but basically every other year a budget is released. It's a biennial budget. It covers the next 2 years, and it says this is the amount of money we're spending on X, X, and X, transportation, on healthcare, you know, go down the list of all the things that the government is responsible for doing. The Appropriations and Financials Affairs Committee is in some ways maybe the most powerful committee at the State House because they determine what is in the budget. The governor comes forward with a proposal and says, these are all the things that we want to see funded. And then basically it gets broken up into a series of smaller bills by issue area. So then it moves to the legislature and it might get redirected to other committees, but the Appropriations and Financial Affairs Committee is making the adjustments that are needed based on advocacy. So just like any bill, you can come in and advocate for a portion of the budget. And it's really important because this is how it's determined what gets money and what does not get money. And ultimately what is funded is what moves forward. And so some of you may have heard about some difficulties with the appropriations table is what it's called. But basically there's a certain amount of money available to be allocated to new bills or new ideas. And if a bill gets a fiscal note attached to it, which basically says this bill is going to cost this much to implement, it has to go to the Appropriations and Financials Affairs Committee, and they have to determine whether or not there's enough money to fund that initiative. And so a big part of advocating, if you're advocating for something that's going to cost money, you have to make sure that you're talking to the folks on the Appropriations and Financials Affairs Committee to say, this is important and should be passed by the House and Senate, but it also has to get appropriated. It has to get money to actually get enacted. And I think a big frustration last session was that there were a lot of really great bills and ideas that got passed, but then did not get appropriated. So they couldn't actually be implemented because they couldn't be carried out. And that's I don't know if I'd say it's a flaw in the system, but it is a frustration perennially that you need to continue advocating throughout. And then you have to keep advocating for your idea to actually be implemented, even if it does get appropriated. So that's all to say that advocacy, legislative advocacy, is an ongoing thing, and laws and advocating for laws are kind of one step in an ongoing process. One thing that is kind of cool about Maine is that we're required to have a balanced budget, so we can't go into a deficit. So at the end of every year, the Appropriations and Financials Affairs Committee needs to make sure that our income is equal to our output, right? That our revenues and our expenses are at the same level. So that's another responsibility of the Appropriations and Financials Affairs Committee. And if you've read any headlines about this year's legislative session, you'll know that the governor has been projecting that it's time to tighten up our belt straps. And she said that the revenue forecasts are such that we don't have enough money for new programs. So she's seeking to continue to fund existing programs, but not a lot of money for new things this year. But that doesn't mean that you can't advocate for new funding sources. And also, if you're advocating for like a new revenue source, it's like we can get money by doing this, then that's great. You can move forward and say, I have this idea and I know how to pay for it. All right, next slide. Defensive priorities. It's awesome to have a good idea and to advocate for a bill and to move that bill forward. But there are also some bad ideas that come forward that we feel the need to push back against. And particularly, there are some administrations that are pro-climate, pro-environment, and there are some administrations that are not. And there are some legislators that are the same, right? And so one good example of this is that every single year since net energy billing became a thing, and net energy billing was the program that allowed for community solar and for basically people to make money off of the energy produced off their solar panels. It was established in 2019, and it led to a huge growth in solar in the state. And a Republican every single year has tried to repeal net energy billing and roll back the benefits that come along with community solar. And so every single year we defend against that effort and try to make amendments. And so the net energy billing program has been amended 3 or 4 times since it was created, and I'm sure it will be again this year. But it's just to note that in addition to advocating for the things you want to see, you also have to be scanning. I guess we'll say, as an environmental advocacy organization, we're always scanning the list of 2,000 bills to be like, okay, which one of these might be a concern for us this year? And then we also have to do the same type of organizing, testifying, against something, which is not my favorite thing to do. I'd rather advocate for things that I want to see happen, but it's still an essential part of advocacy. I think we've gone through most of this. I would just emphasize as well that grassroots organizing, I think, is really critical, and coalition building is really critical. So coming to the State House with your friends, with other people in your community that are directly impacted by the issue that you're all advocating for is, I think, really the best way to make change. That can look like rallies. It can look like coming to Youth Action Day. It can look like community meetings in your district with your legislator. It can look like talking to your friends about something that you care about, right? Organizing happens at all levels. But the other thing I just want to reinforce is that we often like to talk to legislators ahead of them taking a vote and saying, we'd like you to vote this way. It's equally as important to follow up with them afterwards and say either, thank you so much for supporting this bill that we're advocating for, or I'm really disappointed that you didn't support this bill, and I hope you do next time, right? And legislators need to have that type of accountability. All right, onward. So I think, wait, Anya, I'm forgetting now. Am I going to do this, or are you going to do this?
I think I'll start, and then Josh, if you want to jump in.
Okay. Yeah, back to you.
So this is just an example of the way that, oh, Josh is in the dark. Oh no. This is an example of how a bill can become a law, just like the cartoon. So will you start with you or your coalition have a great idea. Could be something simple like we should ban all plastic straws in Maine. It could be something huge like we need high-speed rail everywhere that's accessible to all. And that would be great. If someone wants to do that too. So anyways, you and your coalition have a great idea. A next step is identifying a legislator that's also excited about the idea and asking them to sponsor a bill. So going back to the Civics 101 part, you have to have a legislator or the governor introduce a piece of legislation for it to be heard as a bill. And then you draft up the bill and send it to what's called the revisor's office, which is kind of like a fancy term for an editor. It's a nonpartisan office, and they type it up to get it turned into legal text. And after this, I just going back to Allison's question in the chat, I'll pull up some example bills and share my screen maybe after we're kind of done with this section, and can go through kind of the basic parts of what a bill actually looks like once it's been printed. But so that's foreshadowing. Jackson, if you don't mind going to the next one. So once a bill is printed, it gets referred to a committee. So for the point of just this being an example, we'll say that our bill gets referred to the Appropriations Committee and scheduled for a hearing. Then we would mobilize the masses and go to the public hearing and make our voices heard through public testimony. And at that public hearing, the legislators on that committee would listen to public feedback and then make any changes that they thought was necessary before voting on the bill. So the bill first gets voted on in committee, which is like a 12 to 13 person committee of Democrats and Republicans that specialize in a topic area. So I don't think we went over all the committees, but for example, there's Environment and Natural Resources, there's Energy, Utilities and Technology, Transportation, Housing, Appropriations. Oh, this says appropriate, not appropriations. Oops. Yeah, so there's lots of different committees that a bill could get referred to. Next slide, please, Jackson. All right, so then once the committee votes on the bill, if it passes committee, the bill goes out to what we call the floor, which I don't know why we call it that, but it's either the House or the Senate. So if the bill was originally sponsored by a House member, it would go to the House first. If it's sponsored by a Senate member, it would go to the Senate first. And then it's voted on both floors, in both chambers. The first vote is for engrossment, second for enactment. Like Josh said, it's that kind of bureaucratic but necessary for democracy piece of going back and forth a couple times. And then it's off to the governor's desk for signing or veto. If the governor does veto a bill, it can be overridden if there is more than a 2/3 vote in the House and the Senate. And that happens occasionally, but rarely. Next slide, please. Okay. All right. So now we've got some resources, and I don't know, Josh, how we want to do this next. I'm happy to talk about some examples or share my screen quickly to show a quick bill, and then we can hop into the resources part.
Yeah, let's start there. And then I'm happy to
Okay.
share a couple examples as well, because I think it's valuable. Things
Okay,
go in
cool.
so many different directions at the end of a bill process.
Okay, awesome. And again, if folks have questions, please pop them in the chat. All right, so this is not what I want. This is what I want. So all of the bills that are printed show up in this bill directory, and I'll throw this link in the chat. It's just kind of fun to scroll through and see what kind of bills that legislators have been proposing. And I think so far there's like 200 that have been printed, but we'll get all the way up to 2,600. So I'm just going to scroll through two bills. Bills range from being like, this one's 2 pages, this one's 12 pages. I've seen bills that are like 30 pages long, but they can really range in length. So I'll start with the shorter one, just for simplicity's sake. So they all start with this heading, very fancy, 132nd Maine Legislature, first regular session, 2025. So right now, between now and June, we're in the first regular session of the legislature. So remember, it's a 2-year term for each legislator, so it's a 2-year session. So now we're in the regular session, and then next year in 2026, we'll be in they call it the short session or the special session, which is shorter. It's just from January to April. All right. And then we have it's called the legislative document number 11. So it was the 11th bill printed this year. This gets shortened to LD 11. So you might hear people say like, oh, what do you think about LD whatever? And they're referring to, that refers to a specific bill. And then this number, SP, that means that it's a Senate paper. So that means that this bill was sponsored originally by a senator. Then we have the title of the bill. This is an act regarding temperature standards for school buildings. We have when it was received by the Secretary of State. It's signed by the Secretary of State. And then we have who it's presented by, or sponsored by. So this bill is sponsored by Senator Bennett, who's in Oxford, Rick Bennett, who's a Republican. Oh, and then, sorry, this one other thing. It says which committee it's referred to. So this is referred to the Committee on Education and Cultural Affairs. So that shows you where the public hearing will be. And then we get into the bill itself. This one is a paragraph long. The summary is as long as the bill. So this bill, this sentence is at the top of every bill. Fancy word for saying this is what the bill does. And then this fancy numbers and language is where this bill will fit into Maine statute. So Maine statute is like hundreds of pages long document that has all the laws in Maine. It has tons of sections and subsections. And so part of what the revisor's office does is they identify where in the Maine statute this bill fits in. So this bill fits into section 1, 20A, whatever, subsection 23, which is probably something to do with schools and maybe temperature. And then we have the actual language that will go in to the statute. And then the summary section, each bill will have a summary section, and this is just a helpful summary of what the bill actually does in kind of non-legal language. So oftentimes I'll go to the summary first when I'm seeing a bill to get a general sense of what the bill does. So this bill, I think it's interesting. It just requires schools to adopt policy for minimum and maximum temperature standards for school buildings. Which seems important. So that's an example of a bill. Here's just a bit of a longer bill with a little bit more detail. Again, we have the LD number. This is LD number 1, so the first bill that was printed. This is also an emergency bill. Emergency bills are different than regular bills because they'll go into effect within 90 days of when they're passed. It was referred to the Committee on Appropriations and Financial Affairs. And then this one has a bunch of sponsors, and it's also a governor's bill. So this is a bill that Governor Mills said should happen. And then it was sponsored by the Senate President, Matty Daughtry, Speaker Fecto, and then Trey Stewart and Representative Fockingham are the Republican leadership. So this is a bipartisan bill, kind of a big deal, number 1 bill. And this bill is different because it's longer. And then also it has a nice preamble, which sometimes bills do. And this has really nothing to do with like how the bill ends up in statute, but is more of like, you know, why this bill is important. So this bill has to do with winter storms and addressing storm damage. So all of these different whereas clauses is what they're called, go into, you know, the various kinds of damage that's been incurred by storms in Maine, talks about the lack of capacity and funding that we have to take care of storm damage, and other details. And then it gets into the bill itself. And again, we'll see where in statute the bill will end up. We also have a list of definitions, which is helpful to just know what terms things are referring to. Sorry, I'm going kind of quickly because I also want to make sure we have a chance for other questions. And then you'll also see in some bills what's called a fiscal note, or which is a fancy word for just money. So this section, and I think there are other sections within this bill too, yeah, that have that talk about how much money this bill is going to cost, and also where the money is going to come from. So this comes from other special revenue funds. Who knows what that means? It could be special revenue could mean anything from cigarette taxes to taxes on gas, or fees, license fees, things like that. Basically fees that don't come, or money that doesn't come from income taxes or property taxes, pretty sure. And then again, at the end, we have a summary of what the bill does. And this summary is obviously longer because it's a longer bill. Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing.
Thank you for going through that all, to Anya and Josh. Appreciate that.
Yes.
And Allison, I hope that helped answer your question about like understanding legislative documents. If it didn't, we can go into some more detail. We also have a couple of other questions in the chat that I want to make sure we get to. And Charlie asks, when approaching your rep, can you use your affiliation with a certain group like NYCJ to leverage support, or does that sometimes turn them away? So I don't know if Anya or Josh or anyone else wants to answer that question, but go for it.
Sure. Josh, I don't know. I was just talking for a while. If you want to take a first swing, and then I'm happy
Sure.
to answer it too.
Yeah, I think it's often helpful to share an affiliation. One thing I just want to say off the top, never lie to a legislator. It sounds like a basic thing, but it can come back to bite you for sure. I think regardless of the context or the situation, always be truthful. If they ask you a question that you don't know the answer to, you can say, I don't know the answer to that question, but I can follow up with you after I get home and find out the answer. And that gives you just another opportunity to reach out and make contact with them. So first, don't lie to a legislator. But second, I think it can be helpful to say that you're on behalf of NYCJ, especially like NRCM does an annual State House Action Day. And so every year we try to gather as many environmental advocates as we can and go over to the State House. And if a lot of people are coming up to a legislature and saying, I'm with the Natural Resources Council of Maine for State House Action Day, it reinforces the strength that we have in numbers. I mean, I guess it kind of depends on what issue you're advocating for and whether or not you think the issue is already very explicitly climate justice oriented or not. But my advice would be, yeah, definitely talk about the group that you're organizing with. What do you think, Anya?
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think too, if you're feeling uncertain, it also never hurts to check with folks from NYCJ beforehand. They might have intel about a certain legislator, if they're, a friendly legislator or not friendly to our objectives, or maybe they really like ice skating, and that's an important data point as you go in to talk to them about climate change. So always helpful to like touch base beforehand. And also if you are sharing your affiliation with a group but aren't sure if your personal ideas align with the group that you're speaking for, always also good to touch base beforehand. But in general, yeah, always pretty helpful to affiliate yourself with a group, and helps us to show that we have power as a group. That being said, there are also times when you might feel more comfortable just identifying yourself as a constituent, especially if you're unsure about how our legislator feels about the term climate justice. Sometimes I really lean into with my work with Maine Audubon, I really lean into, oh, we're a wildlife organization rather than a climate organization, depending on who I'm talking to. So even though that doesn't necessarily align with my like personal beliefs, sometimes you have to start thinking about kind of the strategy of, all right, who am I talking with? What's going to be most effective to sway their opinion.
I would just say too, I just told you guys not to lie, but sometimes like when I'm door knocking, not when I'm in my NRCM suit, because I'm over at the State House all the time. People know me as affiliated with NRCM. I'm not going to say I'm not affiliated with NRCM, but if I'm door knocking, sometimes I'll be like, I'm a volunteer with, so and so campaign. I think if you lead with you're a volunteer and you're taking time out of your personal day to go and advocate for something that you believe in, one, you don't have to speak on behalf of NYCJ, but if you say I'm a volunteer with NYCJ, it indicates I'm taking time out of my day to come talk to you, and I'm associated with this group. So that's another little tidbit that I would offer.
Great, thank you both for that. I also want to get to Roz's question. Roz asks, do the reasons for the bills ever make it into these documents? Why or why not? And Roz, if you wanna like maybe provide a little more context, if there's something specific that you're talking about, that might be helpful.
Yeah, I'm just thinking like the I just feel like there's like a lot of disconnect between these documents and what the updates on them and like what's happening within the state house and like how that information gets shared out. And like just like as a regular resident, like how like wanting to understand these bills and just like wondering like where that information and reasoning and background goes and if it ever makes it into those documents, and if not, like where does it come up in the process, if that makes sense.
It's a great
I don't know,
question.
that was kind of a lot.
It's an awesome question. I don't know,
I'd
Josh,
say
if you
first and
want to.
foremost, Roz, yeah, you're the reason. You provide the context. I think you're so right that like, this legislative language is not really conducive to understanding how it fits into the bigger picture, right? It's like, as advocates, you really have to go and tell legislators why this bill is important. You kind of provide the why. And that's what the skill of an advocate really is providing a really compelling why for why a bill should be moving forward. Yeah, the revisor's office turns it into legal language, and I think that can be intimidating for folks. It's still very intimidating for me. I'm not a lawyer. I don't have a law degree, so I can't always interpret what's going on. So I need insights from groups like my group that can go through and understand what this bill is intending to do, and then communicate that out to a network of supporters who can also reinforce the need for the bill. But sometimes you saw in Anya's bill that she shared just recently, not Anya's bill, the LD one, that there's kind of a whereas preamble where there's a little bit of background as to why the bill is necessary. But for the most part, it's the fact sheets we produce, it's the blogs you write, it's the testimony we provide that is giving legislators that background and context.
Yeah, just to add on that too, I think of the bills as themselves as like some of the most inaccessible part of the work that we do. The reason that they're written the way that they are is because they're legal documents to be interpreted by lawyers and our judicial system. And they're written by the revisor's office, which is nonpartisan, so neither Democratic nor Republican. So that takes out a lot of kind of the meat of why a bill is important or not important. And that can be incredibly frustrating when you're reading a bill and you're like, wait, is this a good thing or a bad thing? Or like, why is this actually being introduced? Like, I don't understand. So, and legislators feel the same way, which is why we have public hearings, to be able to allow folks like us to come and, provide our opinions or listen. I always learn a lot in public hearings. about how a bill and this legal language is being interpreted by the legislators on a committee. And that's really where kind of all the information comes together. So it's definitely, and sometimes like organizations like NRCM or NYCJ will come up with like fact sheets about a bill that share in more accessible forms, like why a bill is important and what exactly it will do. So you'll often see things like that, but they're not coming from like the state government or legislative office. So great question. And it would be great if like those summaries at the bottoms of the bill had like more meat to them of like why exactly the bill was being put forward.
Yeah. I will say too, something to look out for, and we look out for it all the time. Legislators can name their bills whatever they want to, and so sometimes legislators will be like, an act to make everything better and make it all okay, and then it's like an act to, what it actually does is like kill all clean energy in Maine, right? Like, so you have to like, you sometimes do have to just be present and understand what is going on in the bill contents itself, because they can try to be tricky that way.
Thank you both for that. That was a great question. Also want to open the floor up if anyone else has other questions or things they, want more detail on. Now is a great time to do that. If not, there were a couple of other things we just wanted to plug for you all, but I'll give it a second if anyone wants to take the floor. Yeah, Olivia.
Cool. Hi. Yeah, I was actually just about to leave for another meeting, but something that you said reminded me. I do a lot of work at looking at policies and trying to track them. And for some reason, the name of it is evading me right now, but what's it called when they rename the bill or they like rewrite the bill and then it like gets and it like goes through that process? Do you know it? I can look it up really quick, but
Is it revising?
mm-hmm. The revised bills. Do you ever have trouble tracking those?
Yeah. But fortunately, the cool thing that NRCM kind of provides and provides for me and for the kind of world globally is like there's 2,000 some odd bills, right? And they do go through revisions and updates. We provide a legislative tracker so that like for the bills that we are tracking, you can keep up to date with the changes that are made. So I can drop that into the chat. It's not going to be holistic. It's not going to give you everything. It's mostly the environmental bills that we're working on, but that is a service that can be provided. And then this is not a great solution. Government websites aren't fantastic, but it is true that like the website that Anya just showed you, like there will be the original text and then there will be the revised text and then there will be any amendments that are added to it. So it does get updated. It's just hard to track it sometimes unless you have the specific bill number and you're entering it and refreshing it day after day. So not a very satisfying answer, but yeah, right. Wabanaki Alliance also has a bill tracker. So like you can try to find those groups that are tracking particular pieces of legislation and they can sometimes facilitate the process for you.
Another option too, and just echoing Josh, like the legislative website, I think is from like the early 2000s. Like it just like it could do so much more and it just doesn't do anything that you needed to do. If you want to get 1 million emails, you can also sign up for emails from the committees through the legislative website. I can try and find the link and throw it in the chat. But that's, I've found like the fastest way to find out if a bill has been changed, because you get an email saying, here's the new version of LD 200. This legislator now is calling it the worst bill ever. So that's another option. But yeah, unfortunately, there's not, other than the amazing resources that NYCJ and NRCM and Wabanaki Alliance have, there's not like a more holistic option, unless you want to also pay for like many thousands of dollars legislative tracking service.
Does the bill number ever change? Or is it usually only the name?
Just the name. Yeah, the bill tracker, the bill number shouldn't change. Though sometimes bills get combined.
Yeah.
So
I was going to bring that up as well. Sometimes the bill will be incorporated into another larger bill, and so you may see that happen this session. but I did post a link to the legislative committees in the chat, and like Anya was saying, you can sign up for their email lists if you want to be inundated with emails, but sometimes it's really helpful information. Olivia, I hope that helps answer your question.
That does help. It helps a
Okay.
lot, and I've clicked on all of the links, so thank you.
Sweet. Yeah, does anyone else have more questions? If not, there was just a couple more things. And I think Phoebe, if you wanted to plug the Listen project, I can post a link for it in the chat, but if you want to speak to that for a minute.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So the Listen project is a collaboration between NYCJ and MIA, Maine Environmental Educators Association. And it is meant to be a large survey of youth climate activists, whether they are young professionals or involved high schoolers. We're looking to get like a broad sense of the young people who are doing environmental advocacy work in Maine. So Jackson just posted the link to the survey. We would love to have your responses to that to help with our data set. And if you take it, you'll be entered into a drawing to win a Visa gift card. So there's some more motivation if you need it.
Great, thank you. The last little plug is that NYCJ is basically re-coordinating our legislative team. And directly after this meeting, we're going to have our first call, just like as an introductory call. But essentially, our legislative team will be advocating for bills at the State House, advocating for some of NYCJ's priorities. So if you're interested at all in, like learning how to write testimony or presenting testimony in front of committees, or just interacting with your legislature, we'd love to have you and take part in the legislative team. And if that is all, then I think that concludes our teach-in for today. Thank you all so much for coming and taking the time out of your day to participate and ask questions. Also want to thank Anya and Josh, especially for being our presenters tonight. And yeah, if anyone has any follow-up questions, you can reach out to us, and we'll be happy to answer. Great. Thanks,
all.
everyone.